Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pam McClanahan, and I'm the project manager for the Historic Maryland Newspapers Project. Thank you for joining us today for our symposium on researching African Americans in newspapers. This event is hosted by the University of Maryland Library's Historic Maryland Newspapers Project and sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm going to go over some logistics for our Zoom webinar and some background information for today's event. We are in the Zoom webinar platform today, and you'll only be able to hear from the hosts and panelists. Attendees can participate through the Q&A feature and the chat. If you would like to use closed captioning, you can turn on that feature at the bottom of your Zoom window with the CC live transcript icon. There will be a Q&A session after each guest speaker, and we ask that you type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will have staff monitoring Q&A and chat. If you have comments throughout the event, please type those into chat. If you have questions, though, please make sure those go into the Q&A so we can share those with our speakers. If you have any technical difficulties, comment in the chat, and Antonia will be responding to your issues as our tech support today. I'm going to go over a quick introduction to those involved with our project. The Historic Maryland Newspapers Project is the Maryland State awardee of the National Digital Newspaper Program, which is a partnership between Library of Congress and National Endowment for the Humanities. Our project co-directors are Doug McElrath, Director of Special Collections and University Archives, and Robin Pike, Head of Digital Conversion and Media Reformatting. You'll be hearing from Doug and Robin later today. As I mentioned, I'm the project manager, and I'm the Digital Projects Librarian here at the University Libraries. We have 3 part-time staff on the project as well, and our student assistant, Alexis Wolford, is here today and will be helping us monitor the chat and Q&A. I'd also like to mention our Newspaper Advisory Board. This is a group of archivists, librarians, historians, and educators from throughout the state who provide invaluable support to the project. Many of our advisory board members are here today, and you'll be hearing from a couple of them during our event. Here's our symposium agenda. First, we'll have a welcome from Doug McElrath, our project co-director. After that, I'm going to give a short background on the Historic Maryland Newspapers Project. Then we're going to have our first guest speaker, Maya Davis, the director of the Riversdale House Museum. Then we'll take a 10-minute break after that. And next we'll have our second guest speaker, Timothy Pinnick, an avid historian and lecturer on African American genealogy. There will be a Q&A session after each speaker. As I mentioned, please choose the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window to put your questions in the Q&A box. If time allows, we will have an additional discussion session with our speakers before concluding our event. We also will have some interactive poll questions throughout our afternoon and an opportunity to share about your personal experience conducting research in the chat. You'll hear more about this later. Now I'm going to turn it over to our co-director, Doug McElrath, who will be our moderator for the symposium.
Thank you, Pam. Before we get underway, I would like to invite all of us to reflect on this acknowledgement as I read it. At the University of Maryland Libraries, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. We acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway peoples by European colonists. We pay respect to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Thank you. It is with great pleasure that I welcome this very large turnout of people for today's symposium on researching African Americans in newspapers. On behalf of the University of Maryland Libraries and our sponsors at the National Endowment for the Humanities, we are thrilled to see this level of interest in a topic of vital importance. As you've already heard, I'm Doug McElrath, Director of Special Collections and University Archives here at the University of Maryland, and one of the principal investigators for our Historic Maryland Newspaper Project since its inception in 2012. I have to say that one of the favorite parts of my job is when I get to spend time with old newspapers. And while I agree with the somewhat cliched statement that newspapers are the first draft of history, I have discovered through my own research that historic newspapers are a critical resource for uncovering previously ignored or forgotten voices. I'm also old enough to remember the long hours spent in front of a microfilm machine searching for elusive information in newspapers until my eyes became too blurred to continue. But now, with the availability of Chronicling America and other online newspaper resources, I think we're entering a golden age of newspaper research. The organizers of today's symposium hope that by demonstrating some ways that historic newspapers have advanced our understanding of the past, and in particular, how they've helped to restore African American narratives that once were assumed to be untellable, we will encourage others to add newspapers to their toolbox of resources for understanding similarly and for undertaking similarly innovative research projects. We also hope that an outcome of today's symposium will be your assistance as our project seeks to identify and preserve titles documenting the African American experience in Maryland. Maryland is a small state that produced giants like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who himself was a newspaper man. But as you will hear today, this state also has countless examples of less celebrated Black lives that mattered, that deserve our attention. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Pam McClanahan, who will tell you just a little bit more about our enterprise to preserve and make accessible newspapers with our state and national partners.
Thanks, Doug. The Historic Maryland Newspapers Project, or HMNP for short, as I said, is the Maryland state partner of the National Digital Newspaper Program. NDNP came out of the US Newspaper Program. The USNP was also a partnership between National Endowment for the Humanities and Library of Congress and happened between 1982 and 2001. The goals of this program were to locate, catalog, and microfilm newspapers published in the US. The USNP established microfilming standards that are still in use today, and the US Newspaper Directory, which is a rich resource now available online. NDNP began in 2005 and aims to digitize select newspapers that were microfilmed during the USNP and make them freely accessible in an online newspaper database, Chronicling America. Each state has one awardee to the program that receives a 2-year grant to coordinate newspaper title submissions for the state and submit approximately 100,000 digitized newspaper pages to be included on the Chronicling America website managed by Library of Congress. States can receive multiple awards as selected by NEH and submit additional newspaper pages. Each state partner contributes their digitized content to Library of Congress, where it is added to Chronicling America. There are over 18 million newspaper pages on Chronicling America, and more continue to be added. These pages come from nearly every state, 2 territories, and Washington, D.C. Newspapers range in date from 1777 to 1963, with the bulk of the content between 1836 and 1922. University of Maryland Libraries, working closely with other stakeholders across the state and our volunteer advisory board, have been participating in the National Digital Newspaper Program since 2012. HMNP has contributed nearly 400,000 newspaper pages to Chronicling America, and we're working on an additional 100,000 pages. Issues range in date from 1840 to 1963. We have Maryland newspaper titles from the different geographic regions of the state, including papers of record for the state. We also have titles representing diverse communities, including political minority groups, labor groups, women, and immigrant communities. Looking to the future, we are working on another grant application focused on content representing African Americans in Maryland. We look forward to hearing from the research community during today's event. You can find out more about HMNP on our website. In addition to Chronicling America, you can also find historic Maryland newspapers at many repositories throughout the state and commercial databases. Now our project co-director, Robin Pike, is going to launch our first poll for the day.
So in this poll, we're going to do a quick 1-minute poll just to get a sense of what your background is and just to see who all is here today. please respond in the poll. About 10 seconds left if you want to get your answer in. Seems like we have a pretty good representation from the library and archives and museums, with also a lot of general researchers. Okay. So here's who is here today. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Day, and I am the Director of Special Collections and Conservation at the Maryland State Archives, but I'm also a board member of the Historic Maryland Newspaper Project Advisory Board. And I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to introduce my friend and colleague, Maya Davis. Maya Davis is the director of the Riversdale House Museum, the former 19th century plantation home of George and Rosalie Calvert, as well as generations of enslaved families held in bondage. Prior to her arrival at Riversdale, Maya was a research archivist and legislative liaison at the Maryland State Archives, where I had the pleasure of working with her. She, at the archives, consulted on statewide and actually even international, I should remind her, projects that document and interpret and preserve African American history and culture, and facilitated discussions on state legislation and contemplated legislation. Maya currently serves as commissioner on the Maryland Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. She is also a board member of the Prince George's County Historical Society. A native Washingtonian, Maya is a graduate of Howard and George Washington Universities, where she obtained degrees in history and museum studies. Please welcome Maya Davis.
Thank you, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. Sometimes when people introduce me, I feel like I'm more impressed by their introduction than what I think of myself. But I just want to say thank you so much to the University of Maryland and this group for having me here at the UMD Symposium on Researching African Americans in Newspapers. It is my honor to be here to speak about a project that I worked on for so many years that has helped me to understand how to put in context what is placed before me in newspapers, what information people want to glean from them, and how to improve on making that information accessible. I can remember being a small girl growing up in Washington, D.C., and watching my father read the Washington Post newspaper every single day. And I could not understand why it seemed like the most boring thing that anyone on earth could do from my 7 or 8 year old perspective. So imagine my surprise when in elementary school, we were instructed to complete assignments on current events where we needed to clip newspaper articles, write about them, and later present them in front of the class. This would then be followed by years in college where I would be majoring in history at Howard University. Those professors instilled the importance of utilizing the university's Moreland Spingarn Research Center, and among the records and manuscripts that I needed to utilize, you guessed it, newspapers. However, it was during that time when my experience shifted, because I was introduced to collections of newspapers published by African Americans and had a better grasp on what information could be gleaned about the Black experience, and would later find out that my own great-great-grandfather, Lionel Valdemar Roberts of the Virgin Islands, was the editor of the Emancipation newspaper, a local newspaper on the island of St. Thomas. All of those experiences prepared me for the work that I would undertake at the Maryland State Archives in the study of the legacy of slavery in Maryland program. Next slide, please. Before I get into the weeds of the project, I first wanted to share how the work started in the Legacy of Slavery program. It really all started with a recommendation from a volunteer at the Maryland State Archives, the late Jerry Henson. I can recall the first time that I met Jerry, who served as a member of the advisory committee for the Legacy of Slavery in Maryland program. It was my first year at the archives and the very first meeting that our team was having with the program's advisory group, which included top scholars and authorities on the African-American experience in Maryland, including Dr. Ira Berlin, Dr. Cheryl LaRoche, Dr. Clara Small, genealogist Louis Diggs, and law professor Larry Gibson, among others. It was extremely nerve-wracking. But Jerry walked in and ran over and gave me the biggest hug and said, "It's been so long, where have you been?" And that may sound like just such a sharp, embracing moment, but I had never met Jerry before then. And I could not and would not tell him that I did not know him, but I opted instead to go along with whoever he thought I was in that moment. And from that moment, we developed a close working relationship. And from that point, when we opened up that meeting, it began with the usual round robin of introductions. Jerry introduced himself most humbly as a hobby genealogist. When he finished, the director of that program, Christopher Haley, actually stopped him and made sure to recognize and acknowledge that it was Jerry Henson, an award-winning genealogist and author, who in the midst of his own research pulled him aside and said, "You all should look into your newspapers and do something with all of those advertisements for runaway slaves." That recommendation moved up the chain archives leadership and eventually led to the authorization of the commission to coordinate the study, commemoration, and impact of slavery's history and legacy in Maryland, formed in March 2001. Funds were targeted by the commission to identify and maintain library and archival resources about the history and legacy of slavery, produce guides, and maintain online databases of relevant holdings, especially those not appropriately cataloged and documented. Historical sites in Maryland concerned with the history and legacy of slavery were identified by the commission, which monitored their preservation and development. Next slide, please. So I say that to say, Jerry Henson has passed on, but I do dedicate this presentation to him, because if it had not been for that recommendation, the Legacy of Slavery Department may have never been an actual entity. I may not have had the opportunity to work with my wonderful colleagues at the Maryland State Archives. So I'm really grateful for the recommendation of someone who used the records for their own personal research and then thought enough that we should share that and make that accessible to our public. So now I want to talk to you about the Legacy of Slavery in Maryland program. The Maryland State Archives Legacy of Slavery in Maryland project began its work 20 years ago, transcribing, digitizing, and interpreting newspapers related to Maryland's enslaved population, which has since expanded to include government records such as certificates of freedom, manumissions, bills of sale, and chattel records. The grant-funded project started through the work with interns. That transitioned into full-time staffing. The need for continuous grants became necessary to fund this project because we wanted to make sure that we covered the entire state, and it began with the counties of Prince George's and Frederick, and then grew on to include Eastern Shore counties of Dorchester, Talbot, Caroline, Kent, and then we also did one in Anne Arundel County, and eventually moved that on to Charles and Calvert County. And so I know that work is still very much unfinished, but it took grant funding to actually achieve the work that was done in the study of the Legacy of Slavery program in terms of making newspapers accessible so that we can build on the narrative of what we knew about Maryland's enslaved and free Black community. The individuals that you see before you are well-known individuals, the Reverend James Pennington, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, And there's two people that I included on this frontispiece because we know so much more now than we knew then when we first started. James Collins Johnson, who was enslaved in Maryland and escaped to Princeton University, where he lived out the rest of his years and became a key figure in a lawsuit for his own freedom. And Douglass's own son-in-law, Nathan Spragg, who actually was enslaved at the Northampton Plantation in Prince George's County, which is a Prince George's Parks site today in the Division of the Natural and Historical Resources Division. And it's so wonderful that we've been able to now take this from paper to imagery, and we are discovering more, and it shows and highlights the importance and the value of digitization and transcription and accessibility. Next slide, please. To begin this work, the project received a National Park Service Network to Freedom grant, which provided paid internship opportunities for students to participate in the research for a project called Beneath the Underground, the Flight to Freedom and Antebellum Communities in Maryland, 1830 to 1860. And those years were marked because, as it had been explained to us as we partnered with different organizations, 1830 to 1860 were a key set of years that defined the Underground Railroad. And that's when you see the heightened increase of individuals who were actually escaping. We have many incidents of escapes that took place prior to these years, and we definitely hope to look at those years at a later date. But in the meantime, our goal was to focus on the years 1830 to 1860, where we knew that we would find a lot of advertisements that could support the work that we were trying to do. For years, the national and international focus of what we call the Underground Railroad was interpreted as an organized network of white abolitionists who put their lives on the line to save helpless enslaved people. That same narrative, which attempted to celebrate the Black contribution, isolated and iconicized two figures, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, to represent a larger network of individuals who over time became nameless and faceless. And that's not to say that we should not celebrate Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. We definitely should, but we need to make sure that we recognize the voices of those many thousands who came before them, during the time that they would have escaped, and long after them. As a result, the focus of the project was to uncover the stories of unknown heroes of slave flight and resistance. Newspapers are some of the most useful tools to document flight during the antebellum era. Subscribers, or as we probably would know them, slaveholders, or their agents or managers or overseers or a family member, usually placed either runaway advertisements or committal notices and utilized periodicals as a public forum to appeal for the return of their property. The newspapers mined for this project ranged from 1730s to 1864. And I know that earlier I said that we had a focus on 1830 to 1860 in that early iteration, but know that in between that time, volunteers like Jerry Henson and Vernon Roberts were actually doing their own set of culling for information and actually sharing with us. And we've worked with different organizations who have also shared different newspaper transcriptions and digitization that we were able to embed and incorporate into the work that we do. And that came from numerous counties throughout the state, as well as Washington, D.C. and Virginia. Each advertisement is unique and can include important information, such as the names of slaves and their owners, the date of flight, state and county of flight, reward for apprehension, physical attributes of the fugitive, and likely destinations. Utilizing newspapers within the archives collections, we identified 3 categories of advertisements that we could collect and curate into a database: runaway advertisements, commitment notices, and domestic trafficking advertisements. In our earlier days, we utilized a pencil and a printed paper spreadsheet to record the information from the advertisements to be later typed into an internal database. Then to capture the images, we had to print images from microfilm to be scanned, uploaded, and numbered, or in the event that there were only original bound newspaper volumes, we used handheld cameras to take pictures of the ads, which were in large bound volumes. They were so heavy, I'll never forget. The newspapers were in various stages of conservation needs. Some were brittle to the touch, and we had to shelve the idea of even trying to transcribe and digitize the information that came out of it. And thank heavens for technology growing and expanding, because the technology came a long way for the archives. And over the years, we were able to invest in a large scanner that was equipped to handle fragile materials and to digitize the large bound volumes. Next slide. And just to share with our audience, and give you a sense of how big those volumes are, this image of myself and Chris Haley, this is a staged photo, because of course we wouldn't be handling that with our bare hands and not using gloves, but that's how big the volumes were. So if you can imagine hours of grueling work, photographing, and trying to be careful with these newspapers so that we can make them accessible. And we did not have anything beyond a small flat bed scanner or one that fed into. So, it took a lot of work to get that done with limited resources. And the picture on the left is a row in the stacks. It's one of my favorite images of the archives because it's very indicative of the ways in which record material arrives at the archives. I don't think people realize, it's not because things are sitting on the archive shelves that they're receiving this wear and tear over time. No, a lot of times this material may have come from someone's home and attic, or it may have come from sitting on a shelf somewhere else in untemperature conditions. Like, it's just a variety of ways that they show up. And you can see that some of the volumes are perfectly bound and kept in good condition, while others have lost their binding and have become vulnerable over the years. Next slide, please. So now I just want to look at our runaway advertisements and talk to you about the 3 different types of advertisements. And I'm going to start with a quote by Frederick Douglass from his book, My Bondage, My Freedom. And he said, all the great turnpikes leading northward were beset with kidnappers, a class of men who watched the newspapers for advertisements for runaway slaves, making their living by the accursed reward of slave hunting. So as I said, we started this work by looking at the runaway slave advertisements because we really were more interested in the groups of individuals who, before they even were able to interact with an abolitionist or someone who was assisting them along their way on their journey to escape, it took self-determination to decide that you were going to be vulnerable enough to strike out on your own and put your life in jeopardy and the life of someone else possibly in terms of seeking liberty. So slave owners placed runaway advertisements in local newspapers in an attempt to retrieve their escaped slaves. By the early 1830s, not only did private citizens of Maryland capturing runaways receive $30 per head, but law enforcement officers received additional monies for exhibiting energy in this aspect of their duties. As time passed, those rewards continued to be enlarged. So a lot of times when you see these runaway advertisements and you're seeing that there's a reward for $100 or $200 or $500, that money is going to pay various people. It's not just one person that's going to seek out and receive this $100 reward. That's why you see there's many hands involved that receive and benefit from the pot of, receiving a reward for capturing an enslaved person. And the advertisements, they range from singular incidents with one individual or a small group of individuals to mass flight incidents, such as the Pearl incident that occurred in Washington, D.C. The image you see before you are Emily and Mary Edmondson, who were actually from Montgomery County, Maryland, but escaped on the schooner Pearl in 1848. And what I always think of when I was working at the City Museum of Washington, D.C., this was a story that I was very interested in, is that April 15th, 1848 was the day that they escaped. And oddly, years later, you know, DC Emancipation would take place on April 16th, and just how close those dates are, you know, not in terms of years, but just being in the same month and being in the same vein. I just think that's really significant and something that we should think about how that ended up happening. But these stories, you know, Mary and Emily Edmondson, they are more prominent now, but when I first looked at them years ago, probably in the 90s, it has grown tremendously, the information that we've been able to glean. And they were one of 77. That's, I believe, the largest nonviolent act of escape by a group. They were unfortunately caught at Point Lookout. And these two girls were actually sent to the slave jail in Alexandria to be sold to New Orleans. And Frederick Douglass, and if anyone here knows me, many people know me from this call, you know how I feel about Frederick Douglass. And so anytime that I do a presentation, I bring some aspect of him into what I do, but recognizing that we definitely have to do our due diligence to bring other people to the forefront. But he actually worked to help secure the freedom of both Mary and Emily Edmondson from that slave pen. And I think that's something to be honored and recognized. But the runaway slave advertisements, they are so descriptive, and they're a great genealogical and research tool because they really lay out the information about the individuals, which was not the intention of the people who were placing the ad. Their goal was just to actually retrieve them. So they gave as much information. And working at the archives, the one thing that I noticed as a trend is that when it came to people escaping, or if they were going to become a part of the free Black community in Maryland, there was further documentation than if they had just continued to exist on someone's plantation home. When you look at tax records of individuals who continued to remain on people's properties, you may just get a Susan or a Joe or a Sarah, a Mary, a Mariah. But the moment they run away, you know, they have a surname, they have an age that you can identify, they have family members that they are likely to run to who also have names. You learn a lot about this community from these records, and it's really helpful. And it also helped to understand that there were two networks of the UGRR. There was the Northern Underground Railroad, which entailed the concerted, organized, integrated system of communication, transportation, and finance aimed at assisting fugitive slaves upon their arrival in free states to avoid recapture and return to slave states. Southern Underground Railroad carried forth a more basic penchant of resistance to slavery as exhibited by the enslaved themselves and others on the plantation in the slave states. This involved running, or in a wide range of ways, helping others to run or keep running, and these two networks can be seen as cooperative. And based on our research, we know that this flight impacted laws not just nationally through the Fugitive Slave Acts, but also in Maryland directly, where they passed several laws related to runaways in and around the state. We were able to then take the advertisements that we received, the runaway slave ads, and compare them with our Baltimore County jail dockets, as well as the runaway docket. And beginning in 1831, a separate docket was created for runaways committed to the county jail. And in the following year, 1832, the county jail records were moved to the jurisdiction of Baltimore City. So from 1832 to 1864, runaways were recorded in separate dockets of the Baltimore City Jail from all other crime-related incidents. Next slide, please. And I don't know, I'm hoping that you can see this clearer. I hope it's big enough for people to see, but I just wanted to kind of show an example of how we could see change over time from collecting this information. And one thing I should say is that if there's an incident and it happened in, let's say, the Pearl, 1815, April the 15th, 1848, then they're going to be talking about this for the next couple of days. So what we would do is we take a photograph of the first image and we'd see how often it was going to run. Newspaper editors and subscribers will also put notes at the bottom of these runaway advertisements to tell you how often these advertisements were going to be displayed in their newspaper. But I'm using this example of Clem Hill, who was also enslaved at the Northampton plantation. The first one on the left, Clem Hill escapes with a guy named William Whittington. And that is in 1815 when he escapes. And the reward is $200, which likely means that they're offering $100 for each of those two gentlemen. And we know that Clem is not successful. How do we know this? Because he appears again, the second runaway advertisement. And this is a separate incident where he's just run away in May of 1817 with his wife, Sophie. He's running away with his wife instead of his friend, William Whittington. And he may have actually been successful on this escape with his wife, because in this third incident, this is 1819, and Governor Samuel Sprigg is actually still looking for Clem and Sophie. That's 2 years later. That he's not been able to have them back on his property, enslaved and held in bondage. So just to kind of show you the types of information that can be gleaned, in a newspaper, you can sit there all day and it may take forever, but once you compile this information and it's in a database, it's super helpful because you can now target who you're looking for, where you're looking for them, who they ran with, who they ran from. All of this information is super helpful. And I'll let you go to the next slide. And so some of those stories, we were able to look at that information. We had a digitized copy of William Steele's Underground Railroad, where he documented the lives of enslaved individuals that passed through his office in Philadelphia that he assisted on their way to freedom. One of those figures being Anne Maria Weems, also of Montgomery County, where we have a $500 reward for her, which says a lot. Women of her age weren't typically valued that high at $500. And, makes me really curious why her owner, Charles Price, would have placed a $500 reward, but he did. But seeing stories like that from William Steele, where you get the written perspective of someone who came face to face with them, and then being able to go back to our database and show that this information was documented in the newspapers has been very helpful. Next slide. And the same can be said for James Pennington, who also had a runaway slave advertisement that we were able to digitize and put in our database, a $200 reward for his return. And at that time, which he writes about in his own enslaved narrative, that he was called James Pembroke and that his owner was Frisbee Tillman. And for those of you unfamiliar with James Pennington, he is the minister who performed the wedding ceremony for a newly free Frederick Douglass and his free wife, Anna Murray Douglass. And you can go forward. Can you go back? It seems like it jumped a little bit. I'm sorry that it seems like it reshuffled some slides, but I'll go for it anyway. One issue that we did face in our immediate collection is that for prominent figures like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, the documents were removed from newspapers, meaning that they were taken at some point by some individual who recognized their value. We are able to see evidence of square cutouts, of whole missing pages that were sliced from the bound volumes. Repeated searches in newspapers of the archives turned up missing pages for those events that took place in 1838 and 1849. This is similar in many ways to what we saw in newspapers that covered the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Many of those newspapers, we see that those editions have been sliced and people have taken that information and have it. The advertisement for Harriet Tubman, the one that we've been able to locate, does sit in private hands. And it's good that that person, that individual, was able to actually share that and make that accessible so that we can see what that information pertained. And I'm so sorry that this slide got mixed around because I wanted to stress the importance of, we know a lot about Harriet Tubman, and there's a lot in her narrative that we can learn from, but her brothers also escaped with her. And in that Runaway Advertisement that I was going to show, oh, thank you. It's the slide. Her brother, Ben Ross, which when we worked on the Harriet Tubman State Park, we were able to uncover a picture of Ben Ross and tie it into this advertisement that shows the escape of Harriet, who was then known as Araminta Ross, or Minty, as she was called by her slaveholders. Next slide. Commitment notices. So commitment notices were actually notices that were placed by county sheriffs, and it was recorded after the arrest of a fugitive slave. It helped to capture the individuals who were successful, and then it also impacted free Blacks who were also arrested under the guise with the sheriff who wanted to accuse them of being fugitives from the law. And so we have a lot of these, and the commitment notices also act in a capacity that they can actually help us to document the successes. And I don't want to even use the word failures, but it shows that this story of flight is not one of success, as we all wish that it could have been. But these individuals, as you saw with Clem Hill, this was a concerted effort that took place more than once, sometimes more than twice. And it provides a lot of information. Some of the commitment notices will say that this individual has stated that they're owned by a particular person, but other ones will say this person has indicated that he is indeed free. Next slide, please. And the last set of ads that we looked at were domestic trafficking ads, which were advertisements for companies like Franklin and Armfield, or slave traders like Austin Woolfolk and James Purvis, where they advertised and requested that they were looking for large amounts of enslaved individuals. And what we learned through that process when we were actually going through is that we discovered that there were people who were having estate sales and liquidating off a deceased person's assets, and sometimes listed at the bottom or somewhere in the middle, maybe even at the top, that there would be names of individuals who were actually being bought and sold. It just became harder to track those incidents because it just really was hard to see it. You're looking at a newspaper, and I can tell you it's really blinding after a while to look at bound volumes with a font that seems like 2-point font. It's really small writing that, when you digitize it, you can blow it up and make it, the size that you're interested in. But when you're looking at it, there's a lot that can be missed. And, working with different iterations of professionals, volunteers, and interns, there's definitely room for error. And, I would love to go back and see if there's a possibility that we missed anything, because there's so many notifications, and some newspapers were better than others about having advertisements pertaining to enslaved individuals in one particular section of their paper, but there were other newspapers that had them all over the place. So it varied in different incidents, but it helped us to kind of understand who the individuals were, how we should go back to the original government records and look at the populations, like who's disappearing from the tax records, and just looking at how that shifted what the population was. When I think about the Eastern Shore, the work that we did on the Eastern Shore, we were surprised to find that the population of free Black to enslaved was about 50-50 during this time period. But we were able to then take what we knew from these domestic trafficking ads and go to our land records and just look at repeated incidents of people like Austin Woolfolk, the Campbell brothers going over to the Eastern Shore and purchasing enslaved individuals that would be later sold into the Southern markets. Please, next slide. And so from that work, we then were taking this and building the stories of the voiceless into biographical case studies. And from the individuals you see, these are well-known individuals. I think they make good picture pieces for my slides, but these people, as well known as they are, Samuel Ringo Ward, Henry Highland Garnett, and Josiah Henson, all started out as unknown people who made a daring attempt to secure their freedom. And Garnett and Ward actually were small children, and we often leave small children out of the story, and we kind of put the onus on the adults and give them credit, and they do deserve credit, but small children were very much a part of this. And I can only imagine what that must have been like, how scary that must have been, how tiring it had to have been. And all the journeys, they vary so much. We saw different modes of transportation. Some enslaved individuals had actually taken, a horse with them, had stolen a horse, or had believed to taken a cart or something like that. And some people simply left on their feet. And so, it's so varied, but we wanted to take this information and not just have people search for it, but like build out stories about who these individuals were. And we had 3 categories that we defined, which included fugitives, accomplices, and slaveholders. And I say fugitives because that's how we started out, but really, as we partner further with the National Park Service Network of Freedom, they stress the importance of language and how we identify people. And we now use the term freedom seekers to describe those people who had traditionally been called fugitives from the law for escaping. And for the purposes of the Beneath the Underground Railroad project, domestic traffic is defined as the interstate and intrastate trade of enslaved men, women, and children, and are similar to runaway ads and committal notices. So next slide, please. And throughout this work, we were able to then uncover the story of people who would have been considered accomplices to flight. And I intentionally, purposely showed the images of Anna Murray Douglass, who was very integral in helping her husband, Frederick Douglass, escape when he was Frederick Bailey from freedom, and the Reverend Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman, who was actually a free Black man born in Caroline County, Maryland, and rose to be the bishop of the AME Church, who was also integral in assisting people with flight as written in some of the various slave narratives that we've uncovered. And William Steele, who, while not a Marylander, he was the child of Marylanders who had escaped from Maryland and settled in New Jersey, and he later opened up his office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But this network of people had an established system that they trusted and opened up to include people that, quite honestly, you don't know if they can be trusted. A newly escaped slave, you don't know at what moment they're going to become so overwhelmed by all that it takes to secure your freedom and want to go back, or if they're going to be fearful of the laws and what that punishment may look like later on. Next slide, please. And then the third category was the slaveholders, and I love to use this image of the governors because oftentimes when we were doing this work, people thought of, just your run-of-the-mill everyday farmer in Maryland, but the run-of-the-mill slaveholder ranged from poor white farmers all the way up to governors and the aristocracy of the state. All 3 of these governors, Edward Lloyd, Charles Ridgely of Hampton, which is an open site over in Towson, and Samuel Sprigg of Northampton, which I shared the runaway ad of his Negro man, Clem, and you saw Frederick Douglass's son-in-law, Nathan Sprague, who was Nace Hawkins when he was enslaved, who also would have escaped from Northampton. They all were people who placed runaway ads or had advertisements placed on their behalf. So just trying to break that up and show a different perspective of how that looks. Next slide, please. So in terms of the voice of the newspapers, the Maryland newspapers were largely written by white slaveholding individuals, including Anne Catherine Green, who, after her husband passed away, he was the proprietor of the Maryland Gazette, which was one of the largest newspapers in the colonies and actually boasted a lot of runaway advertisements from individuals who were seeking to escape. And then the Baltimore Sun, which was then founded in 1837, and by far more than any other newspapers that we looked at, no matter how Southern sympathizing the counties were, these two newspapers contain more runaway slave advertisements than any of the other newspapers that we've gleaned. And we've gotten a lot out of the other newspapers, especially papers like the Port Tobacco Times and the Marlboro Gazette. And we even had in our collection the Washington National Intelligencer, which if you're living in counties like Prince George's and Montgomery, you actually do have to place your advertisements in Washington, D.C. because it boasts its own free Black population where people can hide in plain sight and live amongst their own family community without being detected as a runaway. Next slide, please. And so, as I spoke to you, that was the voice of the newspapers from our collection. But I want to visit another quote from Frederick Douglass where he said, "But how is it with the American slave? Where may he be a symbol? Where is the Conciliation Hall? Where are his newspapers?" And that has been the challenge of doing the study of the legacy of slavery work, is that much of the information that we're gleaning is information that has been written from the perspective of white slaveholding citizens who not only want the return of their own enslaved people, they want to make sure that they support their fellow citizens in retaining the system of enslavement in Maryland. And so they're also feeding into this system, which is why you see multiple ads. And it really, at times, was very hard to just hone in on those ads because we would also see other stories of incidents of enslaved individuals who were in the midst of freedom suits, who were actually in the midst of, I would say freedom suits, there's obituaries, there's just like a multitude. We even saw like Harriet Tubman, like on the same page where people were being offered a reward. She was on the same page as having been a speaker in Boston. And we were really excited when we found that because that's the first Maryland newspaper where we found anything about Harriet Tubman. And I'm guessing it's because whoever took the advertisements from when she ran away in 1849 didn't think that there'd be a small coverage of her in 1860 and speaking. So, we were really fortunate to find that. And so there's all these different things. John Bain of Prince George's County, when his enslaved woman, Judah, actually poisoned his children, that was written about. And it's just like, you can't get distracted by all these other topics that are very important and integral, but, when you're working within a grant, you're working within the confines of that grant. So, it just really, was something that we had to target and focus and build out the story that we wanted to tell related to the stories of flight. But over time, Frederick Douglass, as many are aware, founded his own newspaper, the first being the North Star, which he published December 3rd, 1847. And he is definitely not the first African-American newspaper publisher, but I use him as a figure of Maryland to talk about how the stories of Maryland were then incorporated into these Black newspapers. And it's just amazing how that then grew into our own Baltimore Afro-American, founded by John H. Murphy in 1892, who himself was a former enslaved individual. And looking at those editions of the Afro and finding the Murphy family tree in those editions, and also finding stories of former enslaved individuals at their death through obituaries, when their children were married, or just simply to tell the story of what their enslaved experience was. The Afro at a later date acts as a resource and counters the way in which people are depicted in the white newspapers that we have become so dependent upon. And I have to give kudos to the Afro for always having amazing archivists. My former colleague, John Gartrell, who started with us at the Legacy of Slavery, actually transitioned to become the archivist at the Afro, and now the director of the John Hope Franklin Center at Duke University, followed by Gisette Marshburn, and now Savannah Wood, who actually helped me as I was collecting private personal information about my own ancestor, Lionel Valdemar Roberts. The Baltimore Afro, in many ways, it was local, but it was also very national. I mean, my great-grandfather, as I shared earlier, was from the Virgin Islands. And so to find him and a picture, which I only had one picture before finding that one, it's just really a great resource to have. So I really encourage, as we look at our traditional resources, that we consider moving into some of the other untapped papers like the Baltimore Afro, or even the Chicago Defender and the Indianapolis Recorder, where you can also find Maryland-based information. And these are some of the resources that I use today. The Enoch Pratt Library, if you get one of their e-cards, you can actually view the Afro and the Baltimore Sun free of charge, and using Chronicling America. And Go Digital DC, which I use through my library card. COVID has really proved that our library has gone all out and made things more accessible for us. And I'm really excited to see where we go from there. Next slide. And thank you. I can be reached at the following email if anyone wants to chat after this and find out more information about the study of the legacy of slavery or the work that we're doing at the Riversdale House Museum. I really hope that people come out to our museum where they can learn more about our own history in connection with newspapers, whether that be through Runaway Advertisements or to celebrate the birth and death of members of our very own Plummer family. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. We actually have a little bit of time for some questions, and a few have come through the Q&A box. If any of you out there have additional questions, please continue to use the Q&A function, and we'll ask as many of them as we can. So here's one that I think there might be a quick answer for, Maya. Is there a list of all the enslaved individuals that escaped on the Pearl? And could that be shared? Oh, you're muted, Maya.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, there is. Well, one, I'll say that a book was actually published on the Pearl by Mary Kay Ricks. And that's one resource, but there is a list. I have the newspaper article that I showed, and it may have been too far out in terms of Zoom. It does name everyone who was actually captured on the Pearl, and I'm happy to share that.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question kind of related to the Legacy of Slavery project. What techniques or approaches were used to mine the data collected in the project?
Whew. Like where we were at the beginning is so different in terms of where we were later on. But I will say that we leaned in knowing that Prince George's County, for one, had the largest enslaved population. So we figured that, starting with a county like Prince George's, that it likely would have a lot of movement around the flight to freedom. And so that was one way that we looked at it, is looking at the populations and whether you would have something there. And so we did Prince George's County, and then we looked at the Eastern Shore because we knew people like Douglass, Tubman, Pennington, Garnett, Samuel Ringo Ward, they all were from the Eastern Shore. And so we wanted to know what made the Eastern Shore tick. Like, why were all these key figures coming from the Eastern Shore? And of course, a lot of that has to do with proximity. Like, Maryland is a border state. And so understanding where we are and like how close we are to places and hotbeds of activity related to the Underground Railroad, like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and a lot of places. Like, what we discovered, we really underestimated the state of New Jersey and all the places that were established there. And because, a lot of times when you hear the story of the Underground Railroad, people focus so much on Canada as though it was this promised land. And we had a small project that looked at the War of 1812 that showed us that it definitely was not, and looked at runaway slaves that left during that period when we did the commemoration of the War of 1812. But I think all in all is that you just have to know your location, know what your resources are. And Maryland State Archives has lots. We have a huge collection of newspapers, but we don't have all newspapers. Understanding that newspapers, in difference to government records, are something that are donated. It's not a law that they be transferred to the Maryland State Archives as a part of its permanent collection.
So speaking of Canada, we actually have a question that relates to that. One of our participants is working on an Underground Railroad project from Baltimore to Nova Scotia in 1836. And they're asking if we can make any suggestions for pre-1940 sources to explore that.
Let me tell you, so the Nova Scotia Archives has done an amazing job of digitizing their records. And that's how we were able to continue the work of the legacy of slavery. When we started, we really wanted to use this as an opportunity to not only make this information accessible, but to highlight, what our collections were and brag about our collections at the Maryland State Archives. But in order to tell the full story of escape, you have to then reach out to other repositories so that you can see how this life evolves over time. So the Nova Scotia Archives is amazing. It's an amazing resource. And I wish I knew the link offhand, but I believe they changed the website name. So I would just Google Afro Nova Scotians and something should come up. A link should definitely come up. And they have a lot of digital materials. And we were able to find communities that had been established by Chesapeake slaves that escaped during the War of 1812 from places like Sotterley, Darnell's Chance, Mount Calvert and Croom. They're just able to make so many connections and leaps and just get excited about the fact that these people were successful in their escape. And, even beyond the War of 1812, when people like Josiah Henson and Harriet Tubman go and settle in Canada for periods of time, but understanding that not everyone goes to Canada, stays there. Like the Underground Railroad is very migratory and people, don't stay in the same place all the time because of the dangers associated with people like slave catchers and traders and things like that.
So we have a question about the image of Ms. Weems.
Yes.
I believe that was from William Still's Underground Railroad. But
Correct.
The question was, did it appear in a newspaper? Do you know if it was a photograph or a drawing?
I've never seen the image in a newspaper myself. The only place that I had ever seen it before was in William Still's Underground Railroad. And I do believe it, from the looks of it, it looks like an etching, but I don't know if that was just specific for his book or taken from.
Yeah, there we are. And did she make it to freedom? Do you know? We
don't have any documentation of her return. And she's not the only member of her family that escaped from Charles Price, a gentleman, a scholar out of Canada, Brian Price, or Prince, actually wrote a book about the Weems family. I don't remember, the name is escaping me right now, but that could be a potential resource to find out further information.
So we have a question, were there any underground Black newspapers? Would they have any ancestry benefits?
Underground Black newspaper, there would have been Black newspaper. I don't know that they would have been secret. Now, I will say that Black newspapers were definitely under attack. We know that Ida B. Wells, when she did publishing and she wrote about lynchings and things like that, those newspapers were attacked by local white citizens who were opposed to the messages that they were sending. In regards to making recommendations for newspapers, because I don't get to work with them often enough, except for when I'm doing special projects, I would prefer to compile a list and then follow up.
Next question asks, are you able to tell what the general time frame was between when a runaway occurred and when an ad was published? The slaves may have made pretty good headway depending on the publication date.
Yeah, so usually in the ad, the subscriber would say what date the slave ran away. And we can see from the date of publication when it was placed. So oftentimes it would seem to be like maybe a day, sometimes the same day. If you got there early enough, I'm guessing your ad made it into the newspaper. But I would say 1 or 2 days typically is how it happened, unless you're looking at something that's like more of a weekly publication. Like if it's something that's daily, you can kind of be more consistent about it. But if you're looking at a weekly newspaper, then it'll be a lot harder. And like sometimes, you know, when we thought that people would advertise locally, they really reach farther into other states like Pennsylvania and Delaware to place their advertisements, almost as if they knew that's where the individual was headed.
So our next question is a little bit from a different time period, but let's see how you can handle this one. One of the legacies of slavery in Maryland is mass incarceration. It can sometimes be challenging to locate records on Maryland's prisoners and prison system in the 20th century, particularly the early years of the state penal farm and the women's prison in the late 1930s, early 40s. What are your suggestions for a researcher investigating this subject?
For investigating the subject in the early, like 20th century?
Yeah, particularly prisoners, I think is the issue.
I would probably contact the Maryland State Archives because they do help people with expungements to this day, and just understanding whether records exist in the county courthouse still, or with the agency that created the record, or if it's actually been, you know, transferred to the state archives. I think that's been a big issue. We definitely would see that with vital records, that a lot of people weren't really aware that, you know, there's restrictions on birth certificates or death certificates. And with that restriction, some things had not been transferred. So I think it's very much the same thing for jail records. A lot of that ends up being like court case files and things like that, especially in the 20th century. But I think that, I just would imagine that that person should probably consult the Guide to Government Records, because it really is a case-by-case basis, where something like a jail record is a state or county record. A newspaper can come and we can have like a whole set together. When you're dealing with county transfers, it's not like we had like this one shelf of stacks, like where all the prisoner records are, but like just getting to know and understand your county and looking at the indexes in the Guide to Government Records, so you can get an understanding of what records are there and what records survive.
So here's one for you that I think you might be able to answer. Can you discuss any relationship and connection between Frederick Douglass and the Plummer family of Riversdale?
Frederick Douglass and the Plummer family. Frederick Douglass, he actually knew Henry Benton Plummer, who was the son of Adam Francis Plummer. Adam Francis Plummer was enslaved at our site, and his wife and children were actually enslaved at the Three Sisters Plantation in Atlanta, Maryland, and were later sold to another slaveholder, Gilbert Livingston Thompson, and they lived at Meridian Hill, and they also lived at in Howard County. I've not focused our research on Douglass at this time. We're still trying to uncover a lot of the information related to our fuller enslaved population, but I will say that Douglass did figure into a relationship with Henry Benton Plummer. He also, his son-in-law, Nathan Sprague, and his siblings also knew the Plummer and Arnold Saunders family well, as well. So it wasn't just Douglass. His family members, like his daughter, Rosetta Douglass Sprague, and others actually were in connection with our Plummer descendants and ancestors related to Adam Francis Plummer. But if you look at Maryland records, it really, as you said earlier, Doug, it's a very small state, and many pathways cross and collide as it relates to enslaved individuals and their interactions.
So here's an intriguing question. Were newspapers legally required to run runaway slave ads? Could they refuse?
I don't even recall it. We had a whole listing of laws that we recorded that were in connection to runaway slave ads and runaway slaves, I should say. And I recall that there was one that spoke to the responsibility of newspapers and actually citizens being responsible for putting this information. The sheriffs were responsible for getting the information into the newspaper. I don't remember the specific law, but I think that is something that I'll be able to share. It's on the Archives of Maryland online.
Okay, Robin, are we about at time?
We are.
Okay, so there are some additional questions we will try to make note of, but we're also going to invite everybody to, if you didn't get your question answered, to email it to us. We'll be providing the email address at the end of the symposium. So for right now, I think we've got a 10-minute break. And during the break, if you are so inclined, we have a couple of questions for you that we invite you to use the chat to respond to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya.
We still have about 5 minutes left for our break, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you can answer a couple of questions in our chat. We'd love to hear your feedback. What resources are most and least helpful in your research? And what challenges do you come across accessing resources in your research? You can respond to those in chat. And I did want to just follow up and let everyone know we will be sharing a recording of today's symposium with everyone who registered. And we'll also be including a list of all of these resources that are being shared by the speakers and everyone involved today. We'll be back in just a few more minutes.
Hello all again, and welcome back. We're going to be opening poll number 2. So what are your research interests that you might feel that you've done in the past that you hope to do more of in the future? Thank you all for submitting your poll. We'll leave this open for a minute as well. And if you don't see your interest in the chat or in the poll, please feel free to post something in the chat. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you are here because you have an interest in African American community history and genealogy, as well as specific topics to African American and newspapers in general. So it's great to see such a large response and so many varied research interests. Now for the next speaker. So Mary Mannix will be introducing our next speaker. She is an archivist and librarian and is the Maryland room manager at Frederick County Public Libraries. She is also a valued member of the advisory board for the Historic Maryland Newspaper Project. So take it away, Mary.
Thank you, Robin. I'm delighted to be here today to present information about Tim Pinnick, our next speaker. Tim has played a very important role in my development as a genealogy librarian. Timothy N. Pinnick is a book author, article writer, and national speaker with more than 35 years overall research experience, including all the major US repositories. And if you ever spend any quality time with Tim, he's also been to every conceivable minor repository he can find. Pretty much if Tim sees a library and archives, he stops and go in, no matter what his wife, who may be in the car with him, thinks. His publications include the groundbreaking book, Finding and Using African American Newspapers, which is accessible at many public libraries and academic libraries in our area, including a circulating copy at Frederick County Public Libraries. In 2019, Tim was the coordinator and facilitator of a landmark workshop course at IGHR. For those of you who aren't genealogy oriented, that's the Institute of Genealogy and Historical Research that takes place in Georgia, entitled Building an African American Research Toolbox. I had the incredible good luck to be in that class, and it was a personal and professional life-changing week for me. Tim is a lover of history, has presented papers at 4 large history conferences, the most recent at the 2019 Association for the State of African American Life and History Conference in Charleston, South Carolina. And if you don't get enough of Tim today, and who can ever get enough of Tim, he will be presenting virtually through Allen County Public Library this Saturday. And I give you Tim Pinnick.
Oops. Okay. Sorry, I think I was muted. Here we go. Sound check. Everybody can hear me now, right?
We can hear you, Tim.
All right. Sorry for that. So let's get started. Like I say, I'm very, very excited to be here with so many of you. The symposium, when it was presented to me, at first I said no, because I was really, really busy and I'm working on a major project now. But one of my, you call them the teacher's pet, Mary, who was in my toolbox course, asked me, begged me to please do this. And when I looked at what they were putting together, I'm really, really glad she prodded me to do this, because it looks like a really worthwhile effort here, and I'm pleased to be a part of it. You're going to be hearing me say next quite a bit, because I have a lot of slides. So next slide, please. So for African American genealogical research, newspapers are essential. And that's both African American newspapers and mainstream newspapers. Next, please. For the mainstream papers, they often provide these details and clues that are not found in Black papers. All papers are not created equal, and you're going to find some things of interest and of value in those papers that are not in the Black papers. They're going to be full of these really amazing obituaries for their respected Black citizens. And that's an interesting term, respected. And there's a lot that can be discussed as far as what that represents. But in the Southern mind, usually their respected citizens are the ones that African American citizens are the ones that went off as their body servants to the Civil War, the ones that didn't move very far from the plantation or their former place where they were enslaved, the ones that pretty much kept the same and adhere to the same mores that were in place prior to emancipation. So if they didn't rock the boat and stayed in that community for a long time, they became respected citizens, and you really find some very rich obituaries on them. This information will vary widely in their coverage of African American activities. You won't find a ton of information, but you will find as we go through this talk, we'll divide it up a little bit and talk a little more about that as far as where you're going to find more coverage, where you'll find less. And they may carry news of African Americans in segregated columns. This is one of the few times in my life where I can say segregation is good. Because in the area of historical research, and particularly for African American, those segregated records can really be helpful in that respect. And so a lot of these white papers, for a number of reasons that we don't have time to go into, would put the news of African Americans in a column and call it Our Colored Folks, Colored News, wide variety of topics or titles. And then they complement the news in Black newspapers, and they really need to be used with those Black newspapers in tandem. You need to use them both. Next slide. For African American papers, which surprised me, by the way, as far as a researcher, that African Americans doing genealogical research, or people doing genealogical research on African Americans, they weren't using these papers very much, and it was stunning to me when I realized that they weren't. And that's what really brought about the writing of the book. But African American newspapers, they often reveal new information, some that cannot be found elsewhere. So you're going to find these nuggets of information that's going to really knock your socks off, and you're not going to find it anywhere else. And there's really no rhyme or reason sometimes in why that information is there. They can be a source to confirm information found elsewhere, and we all know as seasoned researchers how important that is, to be able to, when you find you have a piece of information and you're really wanting to or needing to find, a corroborating piece of information to confirm that particular date or that particular event or whatever. And so it's wonderful when you find those things in these papers, and they're there. Covers the lives of African Americans in a myriad of ways, and unlike no other source. Trust me when I tell you, these African American newspapers are absolutely fantastic, and you just will not find the coverage of African Americans so richly in any other source. And then they identify and document community activities and institutions, which were the heartbeat of the African American communities, both large and small. Next slide. There is, and I don't know how many of you are aware of it, I assume a lot of you will be within the sound of my voice, but there is a 21st century barrier to newspaper research success. And I attribute it to something called information overload. Right? You can easily find, if you want to find out, or you want to learn about African American newspapers or newspaper research in general, there's lectures out there, many for you to find that talk about it, and some, of course, being better than others, but there's dozens of them out there. There's online databases, and again, there's a plethora of these databases, both free and paid, from local libraries and societies all the way up to the commercial giants. There's just lots and lots of them. And the key thing is, and another thing that can be very confusing in this process, is that the sand is always shifting. Next slide. And by shifting sand, I'm meaning like usually additions, right? Additions to these various databases, because these organizations, particularly on the commercial side, if they want to keep you paying as a paying customer for a subscription, if you're paying a annual subscription, you don't want to keep, you want to see them adding new pages, adding new stuff. And so you always see them saying, 10,000 new pages added this week or whatever, because they're always doing that. So what is the new pages? What are the new, communities that are being presented at these different various sites? It's hard to keep track of that. And so you have the shifting sand. In the case of ProQuest, which is really one of the more prolific huge institutions out there for information processing, they recently came up with their Canadian newspaper collection, which is wonderful. But you can trust that in the next year, 18 months or whatever, they will have another one out there, because they're constantly improving and adding content, and that justifies their high price tag, even though some of the librarians within the sound of my voice might say, I don't know if anything can justify their price tag. It's quite steep. Next slide. And so again, here's just another example, another huge institutional corporation in the business of newspapers, Redex. And I came across this series. There's 17 of them. So they're breaking things in and breaking them apart into different topics, as you can see here. So they have early American newspaper series. And so if you're looking, urban and immigrant communities and so on and so forth. Again, another effort to kind of repackage or reshape things and to sell these products to universities and educational institutions that can afford them. So the sand again is always shifting, and it's very, very difficult and nearly impossible to keep up with all of this. Next slide. So there is a solution though. This is the solution that I recommend. This is the solution I use, and I find it very effective. And it's a dual solution, and it is the Ancestor Hunt website in conjunction with Chronicling America, which you guys have already heard a bit about, and probably a lot of you use that one more than the Ancestor Hunt, but we'll talk about both of them briefly. Next slide. The Ancestor Hunt. This is where I go when I'm trying to find papers that have been digitized, so online material. So using the Ancestor Hunt is very easy for me to find what's available. If I'm looking for a certain paper, a certain location, it's organized. You can find out where they're available by state and by counties, which is terrific. One of the biggest benefits, and I know you guys have got to be like me when you get so frustrated when you're trying to find a paper for Indianapolis, Indiana, or Coffeyville, Kansas, or something like that, and you think you find something, and you go to it, and then you find it's behind a wall, a paywall, because it's part of a subscription-based site. So now it's going to be very difficult to try to access that, depending on where it is. And so that can be really, really frustrating. But with the Ancestor Hunt, you get a breakdown. So when you find certain papers that you're interested in, you can find out right away whether that paper is free or if it's behind a paywall. And then what Ken does also, Ken Marks, who runs and has created Ancestor Hunters, he really has put together a lot of nice how-tos to make you a better and a more effective user of newspaper sites. I was amazed, quite frankly, when I saw the number of things he was doing. And we all kind of scratched the surface, right? With our iPhones or whatever, we kind of know how to make a phone call, maybe, get into our contacts and whatever. And if we're not one of these, 20-somethings or whatever, we don't know how to do a whole lot with it. And the same thing with some of these databases. We know how to use Chronicling America, in a rudimentary fashion. But Ken has put together some videos and how-tos on using Chronicling America, as the example, that really allows you to get so much more out of it and become much more efficient. So it's really, really an outstanding site. Next, please. However, I have to put this here because it's a new phenomenon. It's something that has come on as of late. I've actually talked to Ken about this, but recently he started accepting ads, and they're all over the place. And so it can be a bit challenging now to navigate the site, whereas before it was just extremely easy. But now you have to be careful on what you're clicking on, because half the time it might be an ad or whatever. And so all I can say is it's absolutely positively worthwhile to use this site. And what you're just going to have to do is it's going to be a steeper learning curve. You don't have to kind of go out to it, and by practice and paying close attention, you can really figure out exactly where you need to go. And then you can avoid a lot of the ads and things like that, and you can be very, very effective. But so don't be shocked when you first go out there and you see these ads popping up all over the place. Ken's like anybody else. People got, he's got bills, he's got things he has to do, and he's done a tremendous amount of work here, putting together what I guess I would call an aggregator, where all of these different websites that you probably have heard of, newspaper websites, Elephant Hind or ProQuest that I just mentioned, Genealogy Bank, newspapers.com, etc. They're all there. and he's pulled out this information for you, even by ethnicity, African American sections and whatever, to where you can go through and find if there are newspapers on a particular location of interest, and you can find that information out. He's very, very thorough, and he updates all the time. So it's an absolute fabulous website for information. Next slide. The other one, which you've heard talked about a little bit here, is Chronicling America, absolutely fantastic website. It's on the Library of Congress. It is a massive newspaper title directory. And what you get there, and what I go there for primarily, is to find out what's available in print or microfilm. So what papers are out there that I can access for my areas of interest that are in print or microfilm. And then I can learn where they're available. So once I find them, I can then find out what repositories across the country have them. And then I can go about trying to bring them to me, primarily through interlibrary loan, or as Mary stated, if I'm on the road. Like I say, this COVID just got to be over so I can get back on the road and visit all these libraries that I love and cherish, and the libraries and the librarians within them. I love you folks too. And then there's a bonus, and I call it a bonus because, again, primarily I'm coming here for the print and microfilm information and trying to find things. But the project that Maryland is doing now, in other places across the 50 states, through these NEH grants and things, they are just every year, and you heard it in the beginning, 100,000 pages that are being added by certain states. And so there is now a very substantial collection of digitized papers, and it's growing and growing and growing. So it's really becoming quite impressive. So that's a bonus that you get too by coming to Chronicling America. Next, please. But let's talk about the two VIPs. I call them very important points. And that is offline. They're related to offline collections, which are so important to the process of newspaper research. You've got to get it in your head. Please, if you don't hear anything else, hear this. The majority of papers are not on the web. Let me back that up. They are not on the web, and they won't be there for a long time. So if you are just going to be an internet warrior, you're going to be missing the majority of the information that's out there, and you're not going to have a whole lot of success. You will have some limited success, but nowhere near the amount of success that you could have in newspaper research if you took it offline. Okay. And the other thing, like with Chronicling America specifically, because that's where you have the print and microfilm repository there, it's massive. When you think of WorldCat, it's like a WorldCat, but there's just like WorldCat, there's not, every library is not participating. It's not mandatory. They don't do it for whatever reason. And there's many reasons, I'm sure, out there, but many libraries are not represented in Chronicling America. So the one down the street, or the one around the corner, or more importantly, the one in your ancestral homeland, is not there. So when you're looking for a paper in that particular area and it doesn't pop up, you're like, oh, it's not there. Don't say that. Don't believe that it's not there. You have to do further investigation offline to see if you can find those. I was born and raised in a little tiny community called Lockport, and the biggest city next to me, where we spent a lot of time, is Joliet. It's about 60 miles or so from Chicago, southwest of Chicago. Well, I don't believe Joliet, which has a really, really nice collection of newspapers, including the Herald News, which I really do a lot of research in. I do not believe that they're represented in Chronicling America. And if they are, somebody please share that information with me, and I'll have another celebratory glass of wine tonight to go at my first glass. But that would be great to hear. But as of right now, again, it's probably one of those islands out there, one of those silos where it's hard to get to that information unless you're actually paying a visit there or giving them requests to look up certain things. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to go through now some tips and strategies and resources. I've been doing this for a long time. My book came out, I believe, in 2008. And so that's been quite a while, over a decade. And I was doing a lot of research before that. So I've seen a lot of things, with the one song, I've Been Everywhere, Man. So I've seen and done a lot. So we're going to go through 12 in the limited amount of time we have here today. Some tips, some strategies, and some resources that I can share with you. Next slide, please. So when researching an ancestors community, do searches on events such as Emancipation Day, Memorial Day, which was First Decoration Day, etc. So especially when you're looking at these African American newspapers, look on these events, particularly those ones that are Afrocentric, like Emancipation Day. Next slide. Here's a wonderful picture. One of my favorite pictures that I came across in my many years of researching. This is Richmond in 1905, and it depicts an Emancipation Day. And you can see they were well-attended events in cities and communities, large and small. African Americans turned out, especially right after freedom came, in celebration of that particular event. Next slide. And here's a newspaper representation from Butler, Pennsylvania. And these are legion. They're all over the internet, or all over the newspapers. When you're doing searches, you're going to find lots of information on communities all across the country that were celebrating Emancipation Day. And this one happens to be from the Pittsburgh Courier in 1912. And again, they're cyclical things. But the other thing too to remember in your research is that Emancipation Days were celebrated at different times because they were celebrating different things. For example, the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, or when it took effect, and different things. So, and even one, I think, is the Haitian Revolution. I think is the mark of emancipation for African Americans, or for Africans. And so you'll find that out too, as far as when you dig deeper, as far as when they're taking place. They won't all necessarily be in January. Some will be in August and other times too, which is really neat. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is a book I came across. Again, I'm a bookseller now, and I just so enjoy it. I enjoy sharing information with people, going to different events as a book vendor, and I get to, the byproduct is I get to learn about all these fantastic books. And so this is one I'm sharing called Oh Freedom, African American Emancipation Celebrations. It's a great book for information on these celebrations, the history of them, and again, that's where you can kind of parse out the different dates that emancipation celebrations were held. And Wiggins did a great job. He was destined to write this book because he then went all across the country, and he charts where he was going as he was going to get information from various communities about Emancipation Day activities and events and things. So it's a really, really good book. Next slide. Strategy 2, take time to search the anniversary dates of weddings and deaths. Okay, very important. Next slide. Here's an example of that. This is the Chicago Defender. It's the sick list from the Chicago Defender in May of 1916. And so we're just going to pull a little tiny sliver out of there. And it says, Mrs. Susan Churchill, 3725 Forest Avenue, is seriously ill. Okay, that's their misspelling, not mine. But she was sick. She was very sick. So I figure, okay, you're very sick, then I'll probably find a death notice on this person. So again, I'm researching and writing my book. I'm going down all manner of rabbit holes. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't play it off like you don't go down rabbit holes. But anyway, so I'm interested now in Susan Churchill, but I couldn't find a death notice. And so I was a little, okay, this is going to be a little harder than I thought. But next slide, please. But because I knew about anniversaries and that type of thing, and memorials being put in papers very frequently by African Americans in these Black papers, I just started looking. I put her name in, I started looking for the anniversary dates and seeing if I could find something on her. And boom, sure enough, it didn't take me very long to where I found in the Chicago Defender, here's May 28, 1921, showing there. And I found, as you can see, memorials for several years on her, and probably there's more. right? And then what I learned is that she had actually died the day after that notice of her illness was made in that particular paper. Next slide, please. 3. Resource strategy 3 is finding a small article on an ancestor in a newspaper outside of where they live should prompt you to take a close look at the newspaper in the town in which they were a resident in search of a larger article. Okay, this is very, very critical. This is something I learned. Okay, next slide. And here's the illustration of that. So on the left, you have the Pittsburgh Courier from Christmas Day, actually, 1948. And this is the article I found. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. You know, Henry Jackson in Georgetown, South Carolina. He was a post office employee that had just this great efficiency rating. And then it gave a little bit of genealogical information on his son, and then where he was a church member, which is always important, trying to get that information out, discover it. And so this was a great little article in the in the Pittsburgh Courier. But I said, here's a rabbit hole for me. I'm like, okay, I'm interested in this guy now. And I'm thinking there's got to be more. So what did I do? I went to the Georgetown paper, and sure enough, here's the article on the right that had come out several weeks before the Courier one. And as you can see, this happens all the time. These major newspapers will clip these articles, cut them down to fit into their newspaper. They don't necessarily want the huge article, but it's an article, it's a human interest story. So they just, you know, again, they just modify it for their paper and run it that way. But when you go to the source, pretty much, of where they got that information, you will find much, much more. And look at Henry McDuffie Jackson. I mean, it's just amazing the information they give there. Much more detailed, of course, about his son and other things about him and his accomplishments. Next slide, please. 4, utilize all your research options. And I talked about this at the top of the session here, but it's so important that I'm beating you over the head with it. You need to identify and search both mainstream and African-American newspapers, and search those newspapers both online, and you have to get offline. Don't reject a paper just because of derogatory language. I can't tell you the number of times I was in genealogy conferences, mingling with people, and we're talking about the subject of African-American newspapers, and they say, oh, the white newspapers, and they start, you know, oh, they're terrible, and you know, all they talk about is stealing chickens and the heinous acts and whatever, all the criminality and whatever, and that's just all they do in there. I can't stand it, you know, or whatever. But you know what? You have to develop a thick skin. And that's what I tell them. You got to develop do you want to find your ancestors or not? Because that really is the central question. And if so, you got to develop that thick skin. You got to go look at those newspapers, because there's going to be things in those papers, especially if it's a local paper where your ancestors were, that's going to have stuff of value to you in your research. And the people that are writing, remember, the people that are authoring these papers, or that the editors or whatever these papers, those were the former enslavers. So, you know, there's going to be stuff in there, and you're going to be interested in them anyway, as far as trying to find information and finding your people. So you just have to do it. Next slide. So here's something, it's a newspaper annual directory, and I use these all the time, and I suggest you do as well. This one's from 1921, and you can find copies of these directories in print at libraries, university libraries primarily. You can also find them online, like this one is online, and I believe you can, I'm pretty sure you can download. They're huge, but you can download them and have them right there in your office with you. Next slide, please. And so here's the entry for Augusta, Georgia. And one thing that people, again, when you've got to go back into the time frame and look at and research based on what the norms and what was going on there, you know, not looking at it from a 21st century or 20th century lens, but from the lens of when these people were living. And so here you see these entries, wonderful entries for each city. Information in general, when you look there for Augusta, it gives you really, really good information when you're trying to write that social history and putting your ancestors in context. But what I want to point out here is the political leanings, because that's important. So when you look here, you see the political leanings of this particular paper. And again, if you're following your history and you understand your history, what you understand here is that for a Democratic paper in 1921, that is not a favorable paper for African Americans. That's the opposite. So African Americans, right? If you think about it, and you hear it every so often, they say the party of Lincoln, right? The party of Abraham Lincoln, which was the Republican Party. So most African Americans were they had their allegiance to the Republican Party. So this particular paper, when as you're assessing its value, you could note that this is probably not going to be a paper that has a whole lot of information favorable to African Americans in there, in that particular paper, but it will have some information, right? And like I told you earlier, you have to look at these papers. So next slide. And when you do that, you will be rewarded, such as an article like this. This is an amazing article that was in the Augusta Chronicle in May of 1911. And so it talks about this highest priced slave in the South. His name was Adam Scott, and he was a miller. And so it goes all through about the fact that how much somebody paid for him. They bought him. And that was a particularly high price. It looks like off to the left, it might even be right there, $3,700 they paid back then in the middle of the 1800s for him. And then you get all kinds of information about them. And here I pulled up some of that, and I'll read it. It says, since the building of the mill down to its present time, there has been one of the direct line of Adam Scott in the mill. Their employees speak of them in the highest terms, and they are competent, careful men who understand their trade. Thus, why their value is so high and they're highly sought. And so you don't think that there's going to be a wonderful obituary for him when he dies? You can take it to the bank. There is going to be one. Next slide. Number 5, major Black newspapers, as they expanded, created local and or regional editions of their papers. Some of them survive offline in microfilm, or in print in local repositories. This is a little known fact. And again, I discovered this as I was writing the newspaper, and actually I got stumped a couple of times. I couldn't find an article and I didn't know why. And what had happened is I had switched from a national paper to a local paper, and it was the same newspaper, but they had different editions. So I didn't know that. And so this is something that Black newspapers did. It was part of their business model, their business strategy. They couldn't operate the same as white papers because they did not have the same revenue stream. They didn't get the advertising from Sears and Roebuck or whatever, the different major companies out there that were buying advertising. They were not buying it in Black newspapers. They were just expecting us to just walk to their doors and buy their products. And so Black newspapers understood what their model was, and they were more efficient in getting subscribers when they followed this model of having local and regional and national editions of their papers. Next slide. So this is just a wonderful, pictures worth 1,000 words. I was so incredibly excited when I found this, and I found it in HBCU, and I'm pretty positive. I was looking at some images the other day, and I think it was at North Carolina Central University, which has a really rich collection of newspapers on microfilm. And oh my goodness, here's a paper that a lot of you, being in the Maryland area, I know we're spread out all over the place, but Marylanders would be interested in, because it's the Norfolk Journaling Guide. Okay, and it is a paper from Norfolk, and it was a national paper. It rose to national prominence, and so you see the national edition, but then they also had the home edition. So if you had people that were that you found that had migrated or born and raised and lived, planted roots in Norfolk, then you'd be looking at the one off to the right, the home edition, for a lot of those little stories and pieces of information about a house maybe catching on fire on a certain street or whatever. You'd be looking there. And then for those of you up in Maryland, down there in North Carolina, in DC, you're going to be looking for that the interstate edition. And if you can find that, it's going to be wonderful, because it's going to have information that's not in the other two necessarily. And so you're going to find things, especially, I just love, I can talk all day. I just love migrations. And so migrations, again, when you talk about migration, the number of people that move from North Carolina, the northern part of North Carolina, into Norfolk and back and forth, there's so many relations there. And so that interstate one will be really helpful, again, for giving you those clues and following those relatives that those ties from those people that were in Norfolk that still had those relationships in those other communities across the borders. Next slide, please. So bear with me, this is one of my longest ones. Many cities have nicknames. This is a cool one though. Many cities have nicknames. Some have several. and a number of African-American newspapers made significant use of them. The more common ones from 100 years ago may not be immediately recognizable to many, like Philadelphia as the Quaker City or Pittsburgh as the Smoky City. But Georgetta Merritt Campbell's book, Extant Collections of Early Black Newspapers, a research guide to the Black press 1880 to 1915, with an index to the Boston Guardian from 1902 to 1904, contains a substantial list, particularly for East Coast cities. Oh, this was a learning experience. This was really cool. Next slide, please. So this is the book. And then here's just a little snippet of the place names for social columns. And you would just never figure these things out. I mean, you never would figure them out, right? And so, I mean, you look at some of these, and then I'm pointing at the one for Syracuse, New York. I mean, really? Salt Sea Echoes? You would know that? I mean, most people would not know that. But when you're searching digitally, these African-American newspapers that they're coming online, and you're looking for Syracuse, and all you're putting into Syracuse, you're missing Sea Salt Echoes, because a lot of the social columns will be, as you can see, will be under the heading of that. So this was really, really a wonderful discovery. And I just was sitting there stunned, and it was just great discovery. And thank you to Georgetta for writing and publishing this book. Next slide. Number 7, Answers in African-American Newspapers. This is an article I wrote for Family Tree Magazine in May of 2011. It outlines 11 benefits derived from using the Black press as part of your research plan. Next slide. This is what the magazine looks like, that particular issue. This is the beginning of the article off to the right. I think it's very well done. I think it really gives you some insight into some of the things you may not be thinking about as far as when you use African-American newspapers. So you need to try to get a hold of this. I can tell you, and I'll tell the symposium folks that they can put because I don't believe my email is going to be anywhere in my slides. So you can put my email that we've been using into the chat, or share with them however you'd like to, so that if they want to contact me, if they're looking to try to get a copy of this article, just you can send me an email, and I'll try to get one to you. Next slide. Number 8, one of the few, and I mean few, extensive indexes for African Americans newspapers is courtesy of James D.T. Abidjan. He is the author of Blacks in Selected Newspapers, Censuses, and Other Sources, an index to names and subjects. This is a 3-volume printed set, which he extracted the names from 43 newspapers. I mean, how meticulous, to do that. Such painstaking work. Many of them dating back to the 19th century. A short time later, he produced a 2-volume supplement, which appears both in print and on microfilm. This dude was God heavenly sent. Next slide. So this is what the 3 volumes look like. They're huge. They're oversized volumes. And what's neat about this, or what I discovered recently, is that what I discovered is when I was searching for this particular book for some reason, and I got hit on a certain library or whatever, I realized that they actually weren't, because typically you find these books and they're in the reference area, so you can't check them out. But these were actually in the general stacks, and I couldn't believe it. And so, which means is that technically they're available for interlibrary loan. And so to be able to get your hand on these is pretty remarkable, not having to go to a library to access them. And I say they're fairly rare. So again, you're not going to find them everywhere. So check that out and see if you can find them somewhere, or put that interlibrary loan request, and you might get lucky. The place that actually has them in the general stacks, even though they're big books, hopefully that won't impact their ability or willingness to send them to you through the interlibrary loan process. Next slide. This is an example of me finding something really, really unique that I didn't expect, courtesy of James D.T. Abidjan. And so here I was working on a research project that had to do with the Grand Army of the Republic. I'd put together a presentation, and then I got really, really interested in Post 50, which was a huge post, a segregated all-Black post in Chicago. And so I was researching some of those guys, and one of the guys, look at this unique name, was Enos Bond. And so I was researching him. And so what I did, again, as a research strategy and as a newspaper research plan, I started whenever I was going out to where I was doing research about an hour away from my house then at Northern Illinois University Library, where they had the books, the indexes. I would go in and I would have a list. So that was part of my strategy. Every time I went there, I would have a list of a dozen names or so that I would run through the index, just look and see if they were there. In most cases, they were not there, but in a number of cases, I struck gold, as in the case of this one, where Enos Bond, I had done a lot of research on him, and I wasn't finding a whole lot of rich information on him. Boom, I find this in the appeal, and it's talking about our great detective, and it's a wonderful account of him. I didn't know he was a cop. I didn't know he was a law enforcement officer, and yet he was not only an officer, but he was a detective, and he was actually obviously a pretty good one. And he got this huge write-up on how he had cracked this case, and it was just some rich information. Again, that unique information that newspapers will give you, but you just have to know how to find this information, and you have to have a plan. Next slide. Number 9, learn to spot cyclical activities within the community that your ancestors may be associated with, so you can mine the information on a regular basis. The election of officers in churches is an example, fraternal societies, local group club meetings, out-of-town conferences, some of the occasions that if you narrow it down, they can be easily searched in offline newspapers. So now that you got that cyclical timing established, you can then go offline and keep looking for them and pulling that information out on that particular topic. Next slide. So here's an example of that. Like I say, in churches, it seemed like I was finding out that at the beginning of the year is when they were reporting a lot of their elections and stuff, Sunday school superintendents and deacons and this all kinds of things. And so here to test that, I just put in here in Genealogy Bank, I used the word Sunday elect for Sunday elections to see what I would get. And then I just selected the first of the year when this was normally taking place. And these newspapers are typically weekly. And so I said, okay, January and February 1924, let's see what I'll get. And so I put that in, I put search now, and next slide. And I got several hits. This one from Salina, Kansas, involving St. John's Baptist Church. Next slide. And as I blow this up, you can see the first full paragraph there. It says the following deacons were installed in this service. So as you can see, they do that on a regular basis. And I could go through now every January and pull out who the people were that were elected to various positions in this particular church, if this was the church where my ancestors were. Next slide, please. 10, a lecture that has been performed dozens of times by me called Finding and Using African American Newspapers. When I was doing it once at the Kalamazoo Library in 2012, they asked me to have it recorded. I said, okay, yeah, go ahead. And then they said they were going to upload it to YouTube, which they did. So it's been out there now for, have its 10th anniversary coming up here soon, next year. But the talk that I give is, of course, based on the book I wrote, and it covers a substantial amount of what's in the book. Of course, not everything in 50 minutes or 70 minutes, I think the video is. And along with some other things I had learned after the book had went to press. So it's a good resource. Next slide, please. So it's pretty easy to find it. You just go and Google, some keywords, Pinnick, Kalamazoo, Black newspapers or whatever. You put them in a string, you throw them into Google, and sure enough, my smiling face will pop up, and I'll entertain you for about 70 minutes. Next slide. Number 11, Marlene Branson. I tell you what, I could recommend her for the Presidential Medal of Freedom when it comes to genealogy in her contributions. And some of you, I hope, if you know Marlene Branson, give us a shot. Mention it right now. Say, yes, I know that woman, because she is outstanding. She's a longtime member of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. She's a saint, wonderful. And she is, I think she may still be doing it. Knowing her, if there's a breath in her body, she's probably still doing this. But she's publishing this amazing series of books, and it's called Early African American Deaths in the Pittsburgh Courier. There's 15 volumes that I've noticed that are available through Clausen Press. Marlene is transcribing these deaths from the paper, and due to the nationwide circulation of a paper like the Pittsburgh Courier, They cover a majority of cover a majority of states and dozens of cities. Next slide, please. So here's just an example from the Clawson Press. I say they're great for public libraries. You guys out there, right, that use these libraries, that use these public libraries, I don't care. This is a great tool to have, whether at the local library or at the university level. They're outstanding. And so you need to advocate those out there, the genealogists and others that are going in these libraries. You can always, lots of them ask you, what do you like to see here? Or whatever, what should we purchase with the newest budget, the next year's budget or whatever. Put this on the list. Get these books if you can. As you can see here, book 6, 1,000+ deaths, and you can see the richness and the vastness of it. It goes radiating far beyond Pittsburgh and all these other communities. Think of all these little towns where these people migrated from. I see in this particular instance, 30 states were mentioned. Lots of those states, lots of those communities are in the South, the rural South, where there is no newspaper. And so these are so valuable for us in our genealogical research. Next slide, please. Okay, this is our last strategy. As part of their business model, African American newspapers published a staggering number of social or community columns. I've documented quite a few of them when I realized their rich value, and a good number of them have been compiled and can be found online. Next slide. I ended up, before I moved on to other things, I ended up with a list of over 5,000 of these social columns from nearly every state in the union. I've compiled them, and they'll be part of the package that you guys get of resources from the symposium organizers. I submitted it to them, and it'll be part of what you get. So you'll get that information. Next slide, please. Okay. I guess you can probably figure out that when it comes to conducting effective newspaper research, I believe firmly that the priority focus should be determining which newspapers have those social community columns for your cities and towns of interest. They are just chock full of information that will blow your mind if you've never seen these things. Next slide. The community social column, again, I'm going to argue that it's probably the most valuable aspect of Black newspaper research available to you. They allow us to reach into other communities beyond the town where that newspaper is being published. Okay, next slide, please. There's my daddy. Wow, who would have known that I would have found in the Chicago Defender, February 24th, 1923, an entry that marked my father coming into the world. Braidwood, Illinois, tiny coal mining town, 60, 70 miles south of Chicago, a little bump in the road. Who would think it'd be in the Chicago Defender? But that's the way African-American newspapers were organized. And once you understand that, you can find your father, right? And so here I am looking at Herbert. I just sat back in my chair that day at the library when I found this, and it was just like really, really neat. And I'm so happy that I was able to share this with my dad. He was still alive when I had made this discovery. So here's Herbert Pinnick's wife, I love that, is the proud mother of a baby boy. And that baby boy was Richard Frank Pinnick, and he was born February 12th, 1923. He's a rock star. Next slide, please. And so here, if I'm going to be doing community social column work, I would start out, or one of the areas where you're going to reap the most benefit are the large national level Black newspapers, and several of those papers have been digitized by ProQuest as part of their historical newspapers, the Black newspaper collection. And so here it is. You can look at it and see what's available. The Michigan Chronicle was just added, I think, within the last year or so. And this is an absolutely tremendous resource. It's hard to find because it's so expensive is one of the reasons. But lots of university libraries, especially these academic libraries, where a lot of writing and publishing and stuff is going on, you'll be able to find them. I heard, and I believe it's the case, it's very fortunate for you guys. So you guys are very fortunate because you had a Library of Congress. I mean, when I say you guys, again, I'm talking about the ones that are listening that are actually from the Maryland area. And again, the Library of Congress, I think, has this whole collection. And you can get your Library of Congress card or whatever, and you can access these. Other people not so lucky, and so you have to really search all over the place. Let me say one last thing before I move on from this, is that lots of libraries, because they cannot afford the whole package, ProQuest allows them to buy sections of it or buy particular papers. So you may find in a particular library, they might have 3 of them that they feel are germane to their particular area, or what they're doing, their focus, their mission. And so you may find not all of them at a particular place that's close to you. You may just find, a couple of them, like the Baltimore African American, the Norfolk Journaling and Guide, or the Pittsburgh Courier and the Philadelphia Tribune, maybe if you're up in the area in Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So here's an example of to try to, again, I always say you tell people to do stuff all the time, but then if you show them and make a case for it, they're more likely to do what you suggest they do. So in this particular example, what you see is a little mini case study that I did, and it was on a community in Champaign, Illinois, in Champaign County. And so I was doing an early 20th century research project there. And so let's see how it progressed. Next slide. What I learned is that the African-American population there in Champaign was pretty robust. And you can see over the period of 3 decades or 4 decades, depending on how you look at this, their population steadily grew from 404 to 1900 to over 1500 in 1930. So there are a lot of people to be observed and talked about, and information shared about this particular community. Next slide, please. So I began with a search of Chronicling America to see what newspapers might exist for Champaign. So I did a search there. Next slide. And the search was for Illinois initially, and there should be something else there. I might have messed up. Let's see. Let's go next slide and see what it gives us. Oh, there it is. Okay. And what I discovered is that there were 154 Black newspapers that have been found in catalog for Illinois. So I'm zeroing in, right? Zeroing in. So next slide, please. So then I did a search and I narrowed it down to Champaign County, Illinois. Next, please. And there I found there were 9 Black newspapers that had been found in catalog, but none of them were in the time period that I was looking for and researching, which was the early 1900s. So I kind of struck out there as well. Next slide. And like I've been telling you, you can't just, be online, you have to go offline. And so I'm looking all over the place. And so I'm using other resources, 3 of them, which I consider, I nickname them the big 3 when you're trying to find offline material. And so I looked in there, nothing. Next slide. However, I was able to find a treasure trove of information on Champaign through social column searches. And so when I started using newspapers effectively and looking for the social, where Champaign was mentioned or where Champaign correspondents had sent their information to these other newspapers, as you can see there are a number of papers that had information for that time period, including that last one is the Indianapolis Freeman, often called the Freeman Short. Wonderful newspaper, a fantastic newspaper with lots of social columns. And as you can see, they go outside of the state of Indianapolis or state of Indiana when it comes to their coverage. And so you can see they had information on Champaign too. And actually Champaign, when you look at it geographically, was not very far from, not reasonably far from Indianapolis. They're straight on, I believe, I-70 or 74. I think I-74, straight shot from one to the other, from Illinois to Indiana. Next slide, please. And so this is just an example of what they look like. This was the Chicago Whip from 1921 for Champaign. And lots of times too, pay attention to who the correspondent is. Mr. Breedlove there was the correspondent for quite a while in that community, which means he knew some people and he was interested in that. it's just a telling thing, right, as far as being able to read and write and that kind of stuff. So it gives you an insight into that particular person too. I'm already kind of interested as who it is when they give the names of the correspondents individually like this. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as we wind up, newspapers are essential to research success. Make no mistake about it. So let's end with a question and an answer. And the question is essentially, which newspaper source is best? Okay, is it the Genealogy Bank? Is it Newspaper Archive? Is it newspaper.com? Is it Old Fulton Postcard? Which one's the best? And this really is a question that I get most often asked by genealogists and historians, and it's really the most logical one, right? And so, okay, let's see, which one of these is the best? Well, next slide. The answer is, and you've probably figured it out by my presentation, all of them are, right? And that is because the more you research, the more each of them will come into play. As you expand and your ancestors are moving about and you're looking in other geographic areas, you're going to find all of a sudden the genealogy bank is the resource of the day or resource of the month or year or whatever, because you're just mining a ton of information from that particular resource because they have those particular papers. But when it's all said and done, as all genealogists know, and we tip our hats to this fact, that the ancestors will dictate they will dictate to us their importance. So with that, I believe we are done. And thank you very much for your time. I hope this was helpful.
Well, thank you, Tim. Your enthusiasm is infectious. And I think we all have been inspired just by your energy as you pursue your research in newspapers. Robin, I think we don't have time for Q&A. Is that correct?
We do have time for Q&A. We're going to skip the final poll.
Okay.
So we have about 7 minutes or so.
Okay. So Tim, first question is actually to ask you to do a little some more shameless self-promotion. Could you remind us the title of your book?
The title of my book is Finding and Using African American Newspapers. And I've got to say that I put a lot of thought in when I wrote it. I knew it had a specific purpose, so it's not a large book. And I get lots of praise from people that they say that it gets straight to the point. It tells you how to find and use African American newspapers. And so they really, really appreciate that. And it's a great guide. And I must say it's stood the test of time, because I have not had to feel rushed to make a second volume because so much has happened in between. Almost nearly all the information in there is still very solid with just a few adjustments.
So here's a question. I think you touched on this, but the question is, how do you find information about an ancestor around a specific date? This person had a great aunt who was killed, but is not finding an announcement of their death. And I'm thinking maybe part of the answer would be looking for those anniversary announcements. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there can be a lot of reasons for that. And many times, I'm a firm believer of this. When you haven't found the answer to something, what that means is that you haven't looked long enough, right? And you have to exercise patience, because it's probably out there. It's probably in a paper that's not online, a paper that you have come across yet. And so you have to exercise some patience. But what you have to also understand when you're not finding it is that these newspapers, unfortunately, before these national newspaper projects came around and things were getting microfilmed and whatnot, a lot of these papers were in print and they did not hold up. And so you're very disappointed when you're looking for the answer was in a newspaper. It had been published, but that newspaper is among the missing issues. When you're looking at that particular paper for that time spot, that specific time, you just find that it's missing. And so that can be frustrating. But I hope that you realize here with social columns and that kind of thing, you still have a shot at it. Because if it was in a paper that is not extant, where you don't have a copy of that paper for that time period, you may find it in another paper now and it may be in Wyoming, and your event happened in Missouri.
So here's an interesting question. How do you identify if you're looking at an actual African-American individual if explicit terms aren't being used to identify that person? Or is it pretty uncommon not to find people identified by race?
Oh, I might have to call this the question of the symposium for me. I absolutely love this because, again, I work with, and I've been working with a lot of genealogy researchers. Like I said, we've been teaching in institutes for a long time, so we really have learned a lot of things about a lot of topics. And so one of the things we stress all the time and point out is for researchers, again, the genealogy research is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so you have to do certain things, and the more you do that, the more the payout is going to be. And so in this example, what I would say, and what most seasoned genealogists would say, is that you have to learn your community. Right? You have to learn that community. So when you're looking for ancestors in their ancestral home, you got to know the fan club, right? You got to know who the friends, associates, and neighbors are. And when you start understanding and learning and knowing and getting out of your silo and learning who else was in your community, who was sitting in the church pew with them, who was going to work with them, et cetera, fraternal orders, then you start getting name recognition. And so now, a great example is that Joliet paper I mentioned during my presentation. The Joliet paper is not segregated in that way. So, you know, the Braidwood column where my father grew up and generations were there. I can go in that paper, and when it says the Braidwood column and they're mentioning African Americans, I'm picking them out. And I'm picking them out through familiarity. And so that's what you have to do. You have to develop a familiarity with that particular community, which you really need to do. And it will solve that problem for you.
So here's a question that is directly from your presentation. It's about those Augusta, Georgia newspapers. The question was, did you discover those newspapers via Ancestor Hunt or Chronicling America?
Boy, I've got so much rubber off the tires of life right now as far as doing genealogy research and newspaper research. And I'm trying to remember I wish I journaled, right? I wish I had kept, you know, little journals of different entries and stuff. And I've done that a little bit, but I know I was on the trail and I was doing something. And most of the time when I'm doing something like this, it's related to a newspaper, or I'm sorry, it's related to a presentation I'm putting together. And so most likely what that was, it was a presentation I was putting together and I was looking for examples. And so I probably found something here in a newspaper or there or whatever. And I was just looking for good examples and I came across it. I really think that's probably what happened in this particular example.
Okay. Another follow-up question from your presentation is about the Grand Army of the Republic. Do you have any general tips on researching African Americans in the GAR or African American Civil War veterans in general?
Oh, I'm loving this audience. Let me tell you, I'm loving you guys because, again, you hit one of my sweet spots. Oh my goodness. I wrote. I just saw that they put in the chat my email, for my business email. So feel free to reach out to me, the person that wrote that question. I wrote an article, another one, I believe it was for NGS magazine. I wrote one on researching in the Grand Army of the Republic, and it was more general. It wasn't specific to African Americans, but I've given a presentation at the national level on that particular topic. So I've got information that I can easily share with you about that. There's lots of information out there. There's lots of ways to find your GAR ancestor if they do indeed exist.
Is there a way to ever research people of African descent in Africa before they became enslaved persons? Do any of the newspapers connect them to their possible roots?
Now, finally, somebody's getting outside of my league. I don't really do a whole lot of research in general pre-emancipation, the Civil War era. Like I say, I do some, but newspaper research wise, I don't do a lot of research at all in the papers that were published before 1865. And I've got to think, and this probably be a better question for Maya than me, but who spent a lot more time in those newspapers. But I just don't know if you're going to find that kind of stuff. It seems like a long shot, and it's and I can go on, but let me. So yeah, I believe it's a long shot. But again, I'm one that's very optimistic in believing that where there's a will, that there's a way. And I think there's probably going to be, to answer your question, is probably going to be something that's so obscure or something you're not even thinking about where you'll find that information. And let me give you an example. Something like another thing I'm really into is government records and congressional hearings and that type of thing. And so it's unbelievable how much stuff you find in congressional hearings. And they ask the most off-the-wall questions and things like that, and so I think those kinds of rich government resources will probably be the place where people get good answers to those or possible discoveries, where there'll be some kind of a deposition or something that goes on related to, and they'll start talking about a person and their heritage going back or whatever.
So real quick, I think we're running out of time, but somebody's asking, is it worth upgrading their newspapers.com subscription to the higher level, because they're not finding much with the basic subscription?
I'm going to say this, and I'm going to try to walk a fine line or whatever, but find a friend. Find a friend that has the Cadillac, right? And ask them to test drive it, right? Sit there with them or whatever. But I would say explore that. I can't answer that straight out, but I would say the best, and that's what I would do, is I would try to find that premium where I could explore and test drive it and see if it does, give you that added value and it's worth you paying the price for that.
Okay, well, thank you, Tim. This was, like I said, this was exciting to, I think, everybody who listened to you. And I think we're about ready to wrap up here. So as we conclude today's symposium, I want to thank all of you who attended. Your participation demonstrates just how important our work has been to locate and preserve historic newspapers. Of course, our work would not be possible without the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the guidance of the Library of Congress, which is the home of Chronicling America. We also rely on our institutional partners across the state and a volunteer advisory committee to help us decide on directions for Maryland's project, which soon will have contributed nearly 500,000 pages of historic newspaper content to Chronicling America. I especially want to thank our speakers, Maya Davis and Tim Pinnick. Their work is inspirational, and it should spur all of us to take a fresh look at newspapers in our research. I think we learned today that historic newspaper research has its own challenges, but that the rewards can be considerable. For me, it's worth the effort, and I encourage all of you to take the plunge if you haven't done so already. Despite their ephemerality, newspapers help us get to the everyday concerns of people, and as such, open a window into the lives of at least some of those we may have thought were completely erased and forgotten. This is an important work, which I urge you to continue. As the Maryland Project looks ahead, we are seeking any information you may have about obscure and overlooked Maryland newspapers that would further document the lives of African Americans and other people underrepresented in the historical record. We are, of course, aware that the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper is a premier source, as we heard from Tim, but due to copyright and licensing agreements made by the publisher, we're not able to include that at this time in our project. However, we do know that there were other shorter-lived newspapers that existed in Baltimore and elsewhere in the state, and if any of you can help point us in their direction, we would appreciate that information. And our contact information is on this slide. Before we go, I also want to let you know that we will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who registered with a link to the recording of today's symposium, a list of resources for investigating historic newspapers, and a short survey, and Tim's email. Although we did not have time to answer all of your questions, please use this email address to send us any questions that did not get addressed, or if you have any further questions that may have popped up after the symposium ended. And with that, we're going to say goodbye and wish you a pleasant rest of your day.